Britain is now facing a grim new title, the first nation to completely deindustrialize. What began in the mills of Manchester and the shipyards of Glasgow is now ending in silence, in shuttered factories, empty plants, and towns that are stripped of their industries. The Telegraph published a very insightful, very revealing article titled, "British industry is now in terminal decline, killed by expensive energy. Britain looks set to become..."
Bond markets that barely made the news, but should have terrified anyone paying attention. UK borrowing costs spiked to levels we haven't seen since 2008. The yield on 10-year bonds hit 5.2%. And if you don't follow financial markets, that might sound abstract, but here's what it actually means. That spike represents roughly £50 billion in additional annual interest costs on existing debt. £50 billion just evaporated into higher interest.
National debt has now passed 2.7 trillion, more than the entire economy is worth, or that over 9 million people of working age are not working or even looking for jobs. These aren't just random stats. They're warning signs of a much deeper economic disaster unfolding right now, and it's happening faster than anyone expected. From soaring living costs to post-Brexit trade chaos, the UK isn't just in trouble, it's headed straight for a full-blown economic meltdown. And the scariest part,
in the 4 quarters to the third quarter of 2024, productivity, so output per hour worked in the UK, was down almost 2.5%. Now, you would hope that productivity, output per hour growth would grow year on year. And one of the ways that it's been explained is it turns out there are more people in the country, more immigrants, more workers than we expected, but output growth has still been incredibly weak. So the output per worker and per hour they're working, as measured, has fallen.
Sharpening her axe, facing a grim economic forecast and a massive £20 billion black hole in the public finances. The Chancellor is poised to deliver a budget that gives with one hand but takes away heavily with the other. Here is exactly how the government plans to balance the books using your money. First, the big news for pensioners. On the surface, it looks like a win. Under the triple lock guarantee, the state pension is set to rise by 4.8% next April. That lifts the full new state pension to just over £241 a week.
Another bad week for the UK economy, with UK bond yields once again rising to the highest level for 30 years. Not only that, but the pound has had a bumpy ride. And a falling pound and higher bond yields are a toxic combination. Just ask Liz Truss. And all this comes on the back of several years of very low economic growth and growing concern over a doom loop of rising debt, higher tax and lower economic growth.
The tension inside London's financial district thickened long before anyone admitted the truth. Banks watched deposits drain faster than they could analyze the outflow. Investment firms monitored their dashboards with growing dread as capital, once loyal to British markets, moved in a steady and unstoppable stream toward Africa. At first, it looked like an anomaly, a temporary shift driven by global uncertainty. But soon the scale became undeniable. Millions of investors, corporations, startups, and trade partners were abandoning the United Kingdom and placing their bets on African markets that suddenly offered stability, innovation, and explosive growth the world hadn't seen in decades. The shift began quietly. A manufacturing consortium in Birmingham announced that it would relocate its new production line to Kenya, citing lower energy costs and a rapidly expanding engineering workforce. Within a week, 2 large British agricultural distributors revealed that their future expansion plans would be based in Ghana, not the Midlands. But the real shock came when one of London's oldest financial institutions publicly confirmed that more than half of its new investment portfolio was being redirected toward African infrastructure, energy, and technology projects. The headlines hit the morning papers with the force of a political earthquake. For years, London believed its position as a financial giant was untouchable. European trade setbacks, domestic political tension, and declining foreign confidence had weakened the British economy, but never enough to dethrone it. Yet something had changed, something far deeper than currency fluctuations or market cycles. The world was witnessing a structural reorientation of wealth, and the United Kingdom found itself on the wrong side of history. Africa had momentum, confidence, and ambition, 3 forces London no longer had the strength to counter. Across the continent, economies that were once dismissed as peripheral began showing unprecedented rates of expansion. South Africa launched new trade corridors linking its mineral exports to Asia. Nigeria finalized a continental program that attracted record foreign manufacturing contracts. Ethiopia completed its major transport and industrial upgrades, turning itself into one of the fastest-growing logistics hubs in the world. Morocco and Egypt expanded renewable energy networks so rapidly that energy investors who once favored Europe shifted their portfolios southward. What stunned British analysts most wasn't the speed of Africa's growth, but the unity behind it. Countries were working together through regional blocs, trade pacts, and shared industrial goals. African leaders were not merely reacting to global economic forces, they were shaping them. And as global investors realized the continent's trajectory, the United Kingdom's position weakened. The trust that had supported London's financial dominance began to crumble. Inside the Prime Minister's office, conversations grew increasingly tense. Advisors warned that the capital flight toward Africa was not a minor trend. It represented a profound shift in global economic perception. Africa was no longer viewed as a frontier market, but as the world's next major center of growth. The United Kingdom, once confident in its role as a global hub, now faced the painful reality that investors saw a brighter future elsewhere. Executives from British retail chains arrived in Parliament with alarming reports. Consumer confidence was falling, operational costs were climbing, and supply networks were shrinking as Africa became more self-sufficient. For decades, African markets relied heavily on British imports. But things had changed. African agribusiness had scaled up. African manufacturing had modernized. African digital services were booming. The continent no longer needed the United Kingdom the way it once had, and investors took notice. A wave of relocations followed. A London-based technology incubator announced it would shift its headquarters to Rwanda, citing access to Africa's young tech talent. A major British pharmaceutical company restructured its global strategy, making Egypt and Senegal its central research nodes instead of London. Even cultural and media organizations began seeking partnerships in Lagos, Johannesburg, and Nairobi, where creative industries exploded with unmatched energy and global influence. London's stock market responded with volatility. Shares of companies with heavy African exposure dropped sharply, then stabilized only after announcing pivots toward African expansion. Meanwhile, African stock exchanges saw increased foreign participation. Trading volumes climbed, new listings surged, and analysts declared that Africa was becoming one of the most dynamic investment regions on Earth. Through all of this, public sentiment in the United Kingdom became divided. Many citizens questioned why their country had failed to anticipate Africa's rise. Economists argued that Britain had grown complacent, relying on old assumptions about its dominance. Others pointed to years of political instability, shrinking trade agreements, energy shortages, and an aging industrial base. While the United Kingdom debated, Africa acted. The power shift became undeniable when African sovereign wealth funds announced historic investment partnerships with Asian and Middle Eastern markets. The move bypassed London entirely. For the first time in modern economic history, Africa was shaping trade flows that circled around Britain rather than through it. The psychological blow was immense. British business media tried to reassure the public, calling the shift temporary. But behind closed doors, government officials panicked. They saw the data. Africa's combined GDP was growing faster than at any time in recorded history. Urban centers across the continent were booming. New infrastructure projects attracted billions. African currencies strengthened. African commodity policies grew more unified. African digital payments outpaced Europe. African tourism eclipsed traditional routes. African manufacturing supplied global chains once dependent on British factories. The United Kingdom wasn't just losing investment, it was losing relevance. British banks desperately attempted to create new Africa-focused investment instruments to recapture the departing capital, but investors had already built direct relationships with African financial institutions. Africa no longer needed London as a middleman. The United Kingdom's leverage was gone. In meetings throughout Whitehall, officials discussed emergency strategies, tax incentives, investment protection programs, new trade negotiations, but none offered a guaranteed solution. Africa had options. Africa had alternatives. Africa had bargaining power, and the United Kingdom had little left to negotiate with. The crisis intensified when a consortium of African nations launched a new joint market platform that rivaled several European trade hubs. Analysts in London declared it one of the most significant financial developments of the decade. Large multinational corporations, including aviation, retail, energy, and automotive giants, announced new Africa-based operations. A wave of European companies followed, seeking access to the continent's rising middle class. Suddenly, the United Kingdom was no longer competing with its neighbors. It was competing with Africa for global investment and losing. The situation became even more destabilizing when a breakthrough in African renewable energy technology attracted billions in international funding. The innovation, developed through a coalition of research centers, promised to disrupt Europe's energy landscape. The United Kingdom, already struggling with rising energy costs, found itself dependent on imports as Africa attracted new investment in solar, wind, and green hydrogen. London's traditional influence over African markets vanished. The continent was confident, coordinated, and economically ascendant. The UK was uncertain, fractured, and unable to reverse the tide. The final blow came when millions of individual investors across the United States, Asia, and Europe shifted their retirement portfolios toward African markets. Funds flowed out of London at a historic rate. Financial commentators described it as the largest wealth migration of the 21st century. The United Kingdom woke up too. A harsh truth: Africa was no longer an emerging market. It was the center of global economic gravity. Across African cities, new skyscrapers rose, industrial zones expanded, and trade corridors connected the continent in ways once thought impossible. Young entrepreneurs fueled booming digital economies, universities produced world-class talent, and governments implemented economic reforms that strengthened transparency, stability, and innovation. Investors finally recognized what Africans had known all along: the future was unfolding there, not in the crumbling structures of old financial empires. London's loss was Africa's gain, and the millions leaving the United Kingdom's markets weren't making emotional decisions. They were following the momentum. They were following the growth. They were following the continent that represented possibility, stability, and long-term prosperity. By the time officials in the United Kingdom acknowledged the scale of the crisis, the shift was irreversible. Africa had risen decisively and unapologetically, and millions of investors, companies, and institutions had followed them. Tied to a new global center of power, the United Kingdom stood at the crossroads of a world it no longer controlled, watching from the sidelines as Africa shaped the economic future London once believed was its own. The exodus of capital from London accelerated faster than anyone in Whitehall had predicted. What began as strategic investments slowly became a mass migration of wealth and business operations. From multinational corporations to hedge funds, the world's economic engines were now pivoting toward Africa. Financial analysts described it as a historic realignment, a transfer of influence and opportunity that no single European capital could resist. Every report reinforced the stark reality: the United Kingdom had been blindsided by a shift it had underestimated for decades. Inside the Bank of England, emergency briefings became routine. Economists and strategists outlined worst-case scenarios: a sustained outflow of funds, declining foreign direct investment, a slowdown in domestic industries, and rising unemployment. Industries that once relied on European and American capital suddenly faced liquidity shortages. London's property market began to cool as investment moved to Johannesburg, Nairobi, and Lagos. Even the tech sector, long considered resilient, reported a slowdown in venture funding as African markets proved more attractive for startups seeking growth and scalability. Meanwhile, African nations consolidated their gains. The continent was no longer a collection of disparate economies. Through strategic regional alliances, African governments coordinated infrastructure, banking, technology, and trade policies to create an integrated investment environment. Joint trade corridors connected ports in Durban, Mombasa, and Abidjan to inland production hubs. A unified approach to customs regulations, currency exchange, and logistics made Africa more efficient than many European markets. Investors, once hesitant, now saw a coherent continent offering stability, transparency, and unprecedented growth potential. The United Kingdom attempted to respond: emergency tax incentives, grants for businesses that remained in London, and attempts to lure back investors were rolled out in rapid succession. But the results were limited. Companies had already made the decision to relocate. Logistics, once viewed as a minor concern, had become a strategic advantage for African hubs. The combination of cost-effective labor, growing consumer markets, political stability, and infrastructure improvements made African operations more profitable than staying in London. Public opinion in the United Kingdom mirrored the crisis. In finance, citizens expressed concern over job losses, the erosion of domestic industries, and the diminishing global influence of Britain. Newspapers ran critical editorials, warning that the country had become complacent, relying on historical prestige rather than adapting to new global realities. The narrative was stark. While the United Kingdom clung to its past status, Africa was building the future. Across African capitals, optimism was tangible. Governments invested heavily in technology, renewable energy, and industrial capacity, creating jobs and fostering entrepreneurship. Young African engineers, economists, and innovators found new opportunities in sectors that had previously been inaccessible. African financial institutions reported record levels of new accounts, foreign investment inflows, and capital formation. The continent's middle class expanded, further fueling consumer demand and reinforcing Africa's position as a magnet for global capital. For London, the consequences became concrete. manufacturing plants that once supplied European and African markets shut down or moved overseas. Banks faced declining revenue streams as their client base migrated to African institutions. Universities and research institutions struggled to retain talent as ambitious students sought opportunities in African centers of growth. Even the political elite had to acknowledge the loss of influence. Europe's historic gatekeeper role to global trade was no longer assured. The United Kingdom's crisis also had ripple effects across the Eurozone. Investors, seeing the United Kingdom's vulnerability, began reassessing their exposure to European markets in general. Paris, Frankfurt, and Milan faced increased scrutiny as financial flows tilted toward Africa. The continent's rise challenged assumptions about the balance of global power, forcing a rethink of long-standing alliances and investment strategies. Africa, meanwhile, continued to consolidate its influence. Strategic sectors like technology, energy, and agriculture attracted long-term investment, creating a diversified and resilient economy. Regional trade agreements simplified cross-border commerce. Major infrastructure projects, including high-speed rail, ports, and logistics hubs, connected urban and rural regions alike. African policymakers emphasized governance, transparency, and innovation, signaling to investors that the continent was no longer a frontier of uncertainty but a center of opportunity. The United Kingdom's response became increasingly defensive. Government officials tried to implement policies to retain talent, subsidize industries, and encourage reinvestment, but these measures could not replicate the advantages offered by African markets. London had relied on its historical position as a global hub, but Africa had created a modern, dynamic ecosystem that outperformed expectations. The structural advantage that London once held, central location, financial experience, and historical networks, had been overtaken by Africa's coordinated growth strategy. In boardrooms across the United Kingdom, executives acknowledged that the shift was permanent. Companies that remained in London faced rising costs, limited growth prospects, and decreased access to global markets. For investors, the choice was clear. Africa offered higher returns, political stability, and a rapidly expanding consumer base. The United Kingdom could no longer compete on those terms. By the end of the year, the transformation was unmistakable. Africa had attracted billions in foreign direct investment, created millions of jobs, and reshaped global trade patterns. Its integrated financial and industrial hubs rivaled Europe's historic centers. Investors, corporations, and institutions that had once depended on London were now establishing permanent operations across the continent. The migration was no longer temporary. It was structural. In the United Kingdom, the consequences were profound. Unemployment rose in traditional sectors, property markets cooled. Universities saw declining enrollment in programs tied to industries that were moving abroad. Political pressure intensified, and policymakers recognized that the country needed a long-term strategy to adapt to Africa's rise. Lessons learned were harsh. Global influence is not guaranteed by history or prestige, but by relevance, innovation, and adaptability. Africa's emergence was a testament to strategic foresight. By investing in infrastructure, creating unified trade policies, and prioritizing technological and industrial development, the continent had transformed from a group of developing economies into a unified, influential, and competitive global force. Investors responded accordingly. What had once been considered high risk became high reward, and millions of dollars in capital shifted permanently to African markets. The United Kingdom could no longer take its role for granted. The City of London, once considered the epicenter of global finance, now faced the reality that influence and wealth had shifted. Africa had leveraged its resources, talent, and unity to create an ecosystem that outperformed even the most sophisticated Western markets. Ultimately, the migration of investors to Africa was more than an economic trend, it was a declaration. The continent was asserting control over its future, demonstrating that global influence is earned, not inherited. The United Kingdom, by contrast, was forced to confront the consequences of complacency. Africa's rise was not accidental. It was deliberate, strategic, and unstoppable. In boardrooms, government offices, and universities alike, the lesson was clear. Global power is now shared, and the United Kingdom had lost its monopoly on influence. Africa had created new opportunities, built unified systems, and attracted capital with vision and confidence. The continent had transformed into a center of growth, innovation, and investment, permanently altering global financial and trade networks. As African cities thrived with new industries, investors, and talent, the United Kingdom faced an uncomfortable truth. Its historical dominance, once unquestioned, had been overtaken by a continent that combined vision with execution. Millions of investors who once relied on London were now firmly embedded in Africa's markets, signaling the beginning of a new era in global economics. The United Kingdom could adapt, but the lesson was clear. Global influence is not guaranteed, and the rise of Africa had reshaped the economic world order. London's edge had dulled, and Africa's markets had emerged as the primary destination for capital, innovation, and opportunity. What the United Kingdom once held as an unchallenged legacy was now a cautionary tale, a stark reminder that growth, unity, and foresight determine who leads the global economy, and Africa had decisively proven that it was ready to lead.